This is Polygon Issuance number 79. We're going to review the fourth day of the NWA annual meeting. This is Jeff Wilcox here, and I'm actually doing this after I've returned home, and I've come back home as my token from Oklahoma City. I've come back with a cold, so bear with me. And I might actually start getting crazy, and I might start singing, because I've started getting songs in my head. Don't ask why. But on Wednesday of the meeting, it started with the keynote from Manson K. Brown, who is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Environmental and Observation and Prediction, and he's also the Deputy Administrator for NOAA. He had a very good talk. I didn't take notes during that because it was interesting, but talking about the type of people you want to be in the field, the type of people he would want in certain things and whatnot. So it was interesting. They also, after that, and then I do have notes now, and I'm going to be sniffling, as I said, so bear with me. And if I sneeze, since this is being done on a Hangout, I apologize in advance. They talked about the NOAA's Warn-On project, the current status and the future of the Warn-On project. They did discuss that a little bit as well. They also talked about the FACETS program, which is forecasting a continuum of environmental threats. So they did discuss that as well. And unfortunately, I'm reading my notes, and since this is being done a couple of days after this, I have no idea what I wrote. But they're going to do stuff about more midterm focuses, or the next focus is going to be on midterms. More stuff's going to be coming, so that'll be really good as well. Talking about the Operation Proving Ground for the National Weather Service research operations, they did discuss that. And that, but the thing that got me, and I'm going to drop down all the way to the end of the first session, the Weather Ready Nation. They talked about that with two different talks. And they had, for Weather Ready Nation, this is the interesting thing. They had 400, I wrote this down, 470 EM offices, 140 TV stations, 70 federal agencies, 60 universities, 20 AMS and NWA chapters, 14 Fortune 500 companies, 11 tribal organizations, and this was the one why I wrote all this down, one hair salon. Yes, a hair salon is a Weather Ready Nation ambassador. Yes, I'm surprised. Do your hair and they're ready for anything. I'm sorry. But the thing they focused on is 14 Fortune 500 companies. Means 486 aren't. I assumed, and they mentioned this, every company is affected by weather one way or the other. So that's what they're going to try to do, and hope that they can get further with that and whatnot. Then we went to the concurrent sessions. I went to the heavy rain one. Excuse me, I'm sniffling still. They talked about MetWatch, which is the Weather Prediction Center's new mesoscale heavy rainfall desk. So they're more or less talking about a lot of what the Weather Prediction Center is now doing with rainfall. It used to be done by the Storm Prediction Center. It's been done by the Weather Prediction Center for quite some time. They typically issue a lot of their discussions during the summer, which is interesting. And then I have to look at what this is. And then they discussed some other stuff regarding to but they did a lot of stuff. I did only a few things because the thing is, and I'll mention this in our recap, which I'm going to do right after this show. This show is going to end, and then another show is going to start. And this may be later tonight, maybe after I've finally taken medication. I have already taken some, but it's still not helping. About my overall view of this. Anyway, Then they had a discussion about the index for anticipating excessive precipitation with elevated thunderstorms. Interestingly enough, it seems like we have a lot of those, especially in the seasons when you get thunderstorms, especially in the beginning of spring, at least here in Iowa, and the end of and in the fall. Now, we had some rain activity here yesterday and last night, including some interesting weather in northwest Iowa that included a few things called tornadoes, which I might discuss in our recap later in the next episode, because I'll discuss that later. But about what elevated thunderstorms are going to produce heavy rain, which ones won't, etc. So they have this index. This is for excessive precip. It's called EPEC, EPEC, or excessive precip with elevated convection. And they did like this formula, which I tried to write all of it down. I couldn't. But they're doing a thing. Oh, excuse me. And hopefully I'm not screwing up 3 or 4 things. But anyway, no, I'm not. Where they were doing a project called PRECIP, or Program Research Elevation, should be, I think, Elevated Convection Intense Precipitation. So there's a lot of things they discussed and whatnot. So they gave like an index of 0 to 3, 3 being the worst, 0 being the thing of where they were trying to see what storms would do which heavy rain events. And they based it off the GFS and the NAM. And it's interestingly enough, a 0 meant a null event, or nothing happened, or it was very poorly done, meaning they would say like heavy rain is going to fall in Iowa and it fell in like Kansas. That would be considered poor. 1 would be poor. Would be poor as if it was a little better than 0, but it's not great. 2 would be okay, but could be better, and 3 was spot on, good forecast. It's interestingly enough, they had 21 events in their research. On the GFS, 2 were 0s, 6 were 1s, 9 were 2s, and 4 were 3s. Of those 4 3s, they all occurred in the summer. This was off the GFS. In the NAM, they had 2 0s, 6 1s, 11 2s, and 2 3s. The 2s and 3s on the NAM were all in the summer, mainly in the summer. There was a few outside ones as well. But it's interesting that there's still some levels that they'd have to fix and whatnot. But it is interesting to look at this and see what they would, if we can be able to figure out with elevated convection with the type of events that might occur. Then there was, the next talk was about environmental parameters associated with heavy rain episodes in the Central Plains. David Pearson from the Weather Service in Omaha discussed this, where he did heavy rain events known as 3 inches or more in the Omaha area, which would mean Nebraska and southwest Iowa, back from 1996 to 2013. He had not added the previous 2 years, this year and last, yet, although he already knew how many there were. So in the 96 to 2013 period, there was 193 events, of which 3+ inches of rain fell in a 24-hour period. And they figured out an index that was based on the PWatt, or precipitable water, and a lot of other stuff. And it was another case of trying to write too fast. I can't take shorthand. But they noticed that the precipitable water is highest in the spring. The ward cloud depth is variable, but it's highly variable in the summer, so that's not helpful of this. The 700 to 500 millibar lapse rate peaked in the spring and then tailed off. And the K index tended to be highly variable as well. But during the next 2 years, last year and this year, they had 45 more. So they have a total of 238 events. And during the question and answers, they had a lot of other people wanting to ask if he wanted to expand it out outside just the Omaha area, maybe into other parts of the country. And they may look at that, but as it's known, when Weather Service people are doing these things, it's very difficult for them to be able to do these research things while working in their shift work and whatnot. So it should be interesting to hear about that in the future. And then there was some other stuff as well. And then in the next session, well, there was the luncheon, which went Wednesday, which I did not attend, but a lot of that was where Steve Harned did his keynote on the 40-year journey with the National Weather Association, which I did not go to, so I can't tell you what happened there. A lot of awards were given out, and I could look up my Twitter for this, but with everybody doing stuff, it's probably long since gone past. That I know that several people won awards. I know Lisa Spencer, former guest on Polygon, was Broadcaster of the Year. Several students, I think a lot of students from OU swept a lot of awards from what I saw on Twitter and whatnot. So it was a good time. Henry, if he had been here on this show, he probably would have said some more about this. But since I'm doing this on early Saturday afternoon, he may be who knows where right now, and I think he's well, I won't say anymore. But anyway, then there was the Wednesday afternoon session. Henry, who's not here, went to the radar session. I went to winter weather because we're about to go into it. This is where I started taking more notes. That's me getting my notes out. First one was convectively assisted explosive extratropical cyclogenesis. This is from a storm that occurred in southern New England back in 2005, where it dropped 17 millibars in 3 hours and 26 over 8 hours, and it produced a fairly heavy snow event in and around southern New England, especially around Boston. And it was similar where there was banding, similar, kind of like high shear, low cape event. I'm hoping to God I'm not completely confusing this. Maybe I am. If I am, don't mention it or whatever. Wait a minute. Let me see. Nope, that is part of it. Where you'd have like warm air and there was like mesoscale snow bands and whatnot, because it did have snow bands, and that's why it caused some heavy precipitation when it wasn't really forecast that well, but enough to be of some worry. And then there was discrimination of surface hydrometeor type using spectral bin microphysics. First thing I thought of is, what's this? And then I took notes. I could read these notes, and I have no idea what these mean. This is what I get for having a cold, and my brain is not functioning. But they were talking about the difference between the snow, rain, sleet, and freezing rain over several models. And they talked about that to get ice pellets, the temperature has to be at least 6 degrees, minus 6 Celsius, which would be roughly about, oh gosh, my brain is not with me today. I'm sorry. 22 or 21. That is correct. 21 or 22. For ice pellets to fall at a certain level. So that's what I saw. And they discussed this with several models and whatnot. And I could go into it more, but my brain is not with me, so I apologize. But I wanted to try to get this in and whatnot. And then there was a thing on a snowstorm, impact of convection on snowfall evolution during a winter storm. This was from the Weather Service in Sioux Falls. This was over an event that occurred in April of last year, where they forecasted it, and the models had it in one place, and then it delayed. The storm got delayed, and the heavy snow, instead of it falling in east or South Dakota, fell further to the east over Minnesota and into Iowa. And it was this paper was more or less asking why it had moved so far to the east at that time. What had happened was, according to them, the snowfall got delayed. It didn't start when it was supposed to. Convection to the southeast of the where the snow was going to fall, mainly over Iowa, limited or killed any chance for the snow to occur to the northwest. That is seemingly atypical. especially if you get a storm with a lot of thunderstorms well to the south. It takes a lot of the moisture. So when you see that we could get 7, 8, 9, 10 inches and then we only get 2 or 3, it's mainly because of the fact that a lot of convection further to the south has robbed the northern part of the storm for moisture. So this was a somewhat of a similar case. And there was like the PV anomaly. There was some more, oh geez. And I'm trying to make sure I don't do any more of this because maybe I just did. But anyway, so that's what was discussed with that one. Then there was the talk about cold air damming that occurs in the southern Appalachians. And they talked about that it occurs at least 50 days a year, and that there's different kinds of cold air damming. There's stronger ones which tend to move further west, typically into Alabama, and then weaker ones that tend to go more toward Florida. And it's interesting, 50 days a year this occurs, cold air damming. Most frequent in the fall and winter, but can also happen in the summer months. In fact, there was one event I remember particularly, only for the fact I do remember it. This was from not a reason, that a cold air damming event did occur during the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, where the temperature actually dropped into the 70s, when most of the forecasters were predicting around 90, but the cold air came in from the northeast. So it can occur in the summer, but it's very infrequent, and you really have to keep your eye on it about these cold air damming events. And they mentioned this goes into a storm that occurred. This goes into a storm that occurred in February of this year that occurred in North Georgia. This was the next talk, where a cold air damming event came in. Models were off on moving the cold air out. Of course, cold air does not move fast. And what ended up happening was an ice storm developed, a fairly major one in North Georgia, where it dropped about 1/2 to 2/3 of an inch of ice north and east of Atlanta. And it was not it was predicted okay because the Weather Service had it down. This was not Snowmageddon Part 2. They got it right. The amounts were a little bit off, and it may have been, and it was a little further south, but they pretty much had it somewhat spot on. So, but that's a case of what happens when you can get a cold air damming event, and it could cause a total change of the forecast. You could go from having rain and 35. If the cold air damming stays in place longer, you could go to freezing rain in 28, or sleet or snow in 22, something like that. So people, especially in areas where this cold air damming is in effect, like the Carolinas back into Georgia and Alabama, they really are weary of these cold air damming events that occur quite often. Now we get to maintaining situational awareness and communicating uncertainty associated with banded snowfall. This was done by Matthew Dukes. I think that's how it's pronounced. If Matthew's listening to this, I'm sorry, I probably just butchered your name. I sent him a tweet yesterday, but it was not about this, where it talks about how they use forecasting for winter weather events, including banded snowfall. And this is where I took a lot of notes. Where they do first, they talk about that changing the forecast too often confuses the public and can lead to people not paying attention. You give them too short a lead time, they can't plan. The public can't plan, neither can the emergency managers or TV or anybody else, like DOTs for like snow or plowing snow, or treating roads in case of some ice or some sleet. So they have a thing where they started this, I think, last winter, and they're hoping to move it to other weather offices, where within 12 to 24 hours plus of the event beginning, they typically put out a graphic, they time it out, they still mention uncertainty, and they kind of do a broad look at what could happen. They don't get into specifics, because if you get into specifics and stuff changes, you have to completely change your forecast, and that causes confusion. And that's what they mentioned right at the beginning. Changing the forecast too often is going to confuse everybody. So they call that an outlook. Within 6 to 12 hours of the event, they go to what they call the alert status, where they get more in depth. They still mention that stuff could change. They narrow down where the snow could fall, especially the heaviest snow. They address uncertainty, if any, that occurs. And at that point, now then they go to the watch period. Now, watches and warnings are issued well before this, so don't get concerned about what I mean when I say watch and whatever. Within 6 hours of the event beginning, you change your tone. They write mesoscale discussions and area forecast discussions. They start to focus on observations, especially upstream. They start to stress the impacts of what said event could bring at that time. And your graphics are being done this entire time, narrowing it down and whatnot. Then you get when the warning status, when the event has begun. You focus on ongoing observations. You emphasize the social media and communications. You gather reports from the field. You send out the 30-second videos they do. They do radar GIFs. They use traffic cameras. But the thing about it is, all messages don't fit everybody that needs them. For example, because it needs to vary, because the message needs to be communicated well to the public, school systems, emergency managers, DOT, etc. Not all one message does not fit all. It's not a one-size-fits-all message. And that was very plainly done. This is something that is very interesting. It may help me and us at the Weather Network, which I do some work with in the future and whatnot. So this was by far the most interesting thing that I took off of this thing. Now, Wednesday night, there was the evening session where everybody, and I won't mention who, but I'll mention there was a lot of drinking. So let's just say that. Greg Carbon did his review of significant weather events. He did his 9 because he will do his 10th at the end of the year. The first one that he did, was the Boston snowfall event, where Boston just had a record amount of snow for the winter, and a lot of the snow didn't melt until late spring and even into the summer and whatnot. And then second was the watchless winter, where there were very few tornado and severe thunderstorm watches, only a handful through the month of March, which was very low, and they said that was under the 99% or 1 percentile for lowest amount during a period. And I'm going to have to blow my nose, so excuse me. But that's what they did with that, with the severe thunderstorm and tornado warning or watches, because there was very few, and it was very odd that it was that low. It did pick back up later in the year, but still, it was very abnormal for winter. A seasonal severe weather forecast. Now, this was done from, and I can't remember what Greg Carbon said, but it was written in Nature Geoscience, where they actually did a seasonal severe weather forecast for this year. The first time that had ever been happened, where they said that there was probabilities of above normal, average, and below normal. And I believe it, if I remember, I didn't write this down. I think they said 60% normal, I think it was. And from what Greg showed, it looks to be that it was probably about right. Whether or not probabilities, you could say there's going to be a 100% chance of a hurricane. And that's almost like saying there's a 100% chance of a hurricane in the Atlantic. Well, there's only been a few times where there was never a hurricane. But we'll see what they can come up with. Doing it one time is not going to be like a, oh my gosh moment. We need to see a lot more of this in the years to come before we really start to wonder if they got it down to a certain extent. They've done a lot of research in the past to get to this point. So number 4 was the Fairdale tornado, also known as the Rochelle-Fairdale tornado. This was, at this point, the strongest tornado of the year. It occurred on April 9th. The tornado hit the town of Fairdale and pretty much destroyed the town. Killed 2 people. I think it killed 2 people. And it was part of an outbreak that included tornadoes in I think Iowa, Illinois, and maybe Missouri or in Wisconsin. I can't remember. But anyway, and it was very picturesque. They had lots of video as well. It was a very big tornado, and it was the strongest tornado in Chicago's area of responsibility since Plainfield, 1990. And it was the last EF4. It was an EF4 tornado. It was the first EF4 in Illinois since the November Washington, Illinois tornado back in 2013. And then number 5, the wettest month on record for the continental United States in May. This was mainly due to the just feet of rain, and I said feet of rain, that occurred in Oklahoma and Texas, which pretty much ended their drought. They went from exceptional drought, and 3-4 weeks later, they had no drought. Of course, that's because all the rain fell and went into the rivers. There was record flooding on the Red River, especially downstream from Wichita Falls. A lot of roads were closed. Some roads were wiped out. It was really, there was a lot of heavy rain in Oklahoma. Lots of flash flood emergencies that occurred in Oklahoma, especially during the active month of May, where there was a lot of tornadoes in Oklahoma, specifically Bridge Creek, which was on May 6th, which turned into a flash flood event as well. And then number 6 and 7 have to do with the West. Too much drought, too many fires, and too hot. It was the warmest on record in the West, again, where reservoirs are drying up. There's no snowpack. Temperatures were way too high. There was numerous fires. It seems like this year the fires were concentrated more in the Northwest, specifically in Washington and whatnot. So there was a lot of issues with that. And it looks like we can hope that El Nino is going to help with some of the rain, especially in Central and Southern California, maybe in the entire West. But it's going to, they said it's going to take, it's not, even if they get above average rain, the drought will probably, you'd need above average rain for at least several years to get back to normal. And they may never be able to recover, at least right away. So it's a very it's a very serious situation out there. Number 8 was the deadly flash flooding that occurred in southern Utah. This was a flash flood event that occurred near Zion National Park in southern Utah. It killed many people. I think 15 were killed in one event alone. I think another 5 were killed later, so I think there was 20 that were killed in and around the part of southern Utah. It's the deadliest flash flood event in quite a while. Deadly, I think it was one of the deadliest in Utah. May have been the deadliest in Utah. So there was that about that event, which was odd because this is in the West where we just talked about drought and fire. Now we're talking about flash flooding. Interesting and kind of ironic, but this was part of the monsoonal flow that was coming in from the south and west. Number 9, you'd be surprised. Joaquin / South Carolina flood. Joaquin developed into a fairly major hurricane, but a portion of it, not the storm itself, a separate system. There was an upper level low in the southeast, and you had a fetch coming in from Joaquin, which was in the Bahamas, that kind of pivoted into South Carolina and parts of North Carolina, where it dumped up to 10 to 20 inches of rain and flooded a lot of South Carolina. There's 500 to 1,000 year flood events there. Very bad there. And that was only a couple of weeks ago. And they're still recovering at this point. There's still some bad areas that are in a little bit of trouble right now. But Joaquin never got to the United States. Models kept wanting to bring it into the United States, and eventually it went off and into the North Atlantic without hitting anybody. It moved through the Bahamas very slowly. It was in the Bahamas for over 36 hours. as it was pretty much at a dead crawl in that area before it pivoted to the north and east. And that's all the 9 right now. Now, number 10. Now, this was done on Wednesday. I will say there might be some candidates for number 10. And number 10 could be what occurred in Mexico yesterday, which would be Friday the 23rd. And that's Hurricane Patricia. So, now when this talk was taking place Wednesday night, Patricia, I believe, was a Category 1 hurricane. Okay, Category 1 hurricane. It may have even been a tropical storm. I don't remember. Wednesday night. Yes, it was Wednesday night. I think it became a hurricane. By Thursday morning, it was still a hurricane. I think it was Category 3. I'm trying to think. Category 3, it might have been. And there was talk that it was going to strengthen. It explosively strengthened. On Thursday and into especially Thursday night, the pressure dropped to 880 millibars. That's the lowest central pressure for any storm in the Western Hemisphere, beating out Hurricane Wilma from 10 years ago, which went to 882. Patricia went to 880. And in some cases, there may have even been talk, it may have even dropped to 878. We'll see. Maximum sustained winds were 200 miles per hour. Let me repeat that. 200 miles per hour. That is the strongest storm for sustained winds in the Eastern Pacific. And I might add, when there was the super typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippines, that peaked at 195, and Patricia peaked at 200. Now, Haiyan made landfall at the Philippines at peak, whereas Patricia did not, luckily. It did drop down, but only to 160 when it made landfall in Mexico last night. And at the current time of this, I'm doing this in the early afternoon, Patricia is now a depression. I repeat, Patricia last night made landfall as a Category 5. Today, this afternoon, it's a depression. That's what mountains will do for you. It ripped the storm up, and it is causing, and this may cause number 10 to be not only Patricia, but another flood event that's occurring in Texas again, where the entire eastern half of Texas is getting inundated again with flooding rain. I-35 was closed south of Dallas near Corsicana, or was that I-45 north of Houston? I don't remember. It was closed. I think it was 45, 35. Corsicana, Texas. Don't drive there. It was flooded. I think that's 35 or 45. I can't remember. I'd have to look it up. But there's a lot of heavy rain. It's continuing. It's ongoing right now. So this is a current event. We'll see what Greg Carbon may come up with for his 10th one. But that was interesting. So they did discuss that at that point. Now, then they discussed the tri-state tornado. What happened? This was from Pat Spoden at the Weather Service in Paducah. What would happen if the tri-state tornado happened today? They came up with some stuff. I didn't do very many notes, but I do remember a lot of this. They would think that, given the fact of everything, that SPC would likely, because this was done with some people from SPC, namely John Hart, that they would have probably a tornado watch issued for the area around noon, and that on day 2, I think they said they would be at enhanced, and day 1 would be moderate in the area and down south. Because remember, the day of the tri-state tornado, that wasn't just the only tornado. There was at least a handful of tornadoes all the way down into Mississippi, and I think Tennessee, Mississippi, and whatnot. And they would have probably issued several watches onward. When you only get 15 minutes to do something that's this interesting, it's kind of sad, and I'll make a mention about that in a later topic. Then there was the tornadoes and severe weather affected this north and south during the Civil War, which was done by Tim Troutman for the Weather Service in Huntsville, where it described events that occurred, the tornadoes that seemingly were hitting a lot of places, during the Civil War, including one certain battle where a tornado actually affected the battle itself. This was, I think, island number 10. That was along the Mississippi River, where a tornado hit, which actually caused some damage. And then another tornado hit, and the storm was so severe that the Union decided or said that they were going to attack during the severe storm, or something to that effect, and the Confederates just gave up, and eventually everybody gave up, but eventually the Union won, and that's how they got the Mississippi River down to near Memphis at the time. And they went through some more events that occurred of tornadoes all the way through the Civil War and how it affected. Especially, there was a really bad severe storm that affected during the Second Manassas event, where eventually it was so bad, both gave up, the Confederates and the Union, and that's when the Union went back to Washington, D.C., and the Confederates stayed in Virginia, because otherwise, if the weather had not, we would have had a different outcome. But there was also some other talks about the 100 inches of snow that occurred in 18 hours in Capricotta, Italy. I did not attend that. I went back to my hotel room after that. They did a historical live tweet event from the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. That was done from the Weather Service in Marquette. And then Henry Rothenberg from WACH in Columbia discussed the flood, which I mentioned from Greg Carbon, the South Carolina flood that occurred only a few weeks ago. And then that was it for the rest of Wednesday. Now, I'll mention this. Now, when I do my recap of the entire event, Thursday, I'll say this now since I was there. Thursday, we only attended half of the morning session, and then we left after that. So that's why I'm not going to recap a whole Thursday event, because I was only there for about 2 hours, or less than 2 hours for the morning event on Thursday. But anyway, so it was a good event on Wednesday. It was very long, very tedious and whatnot. So we will recap the whole event probably later tonight, so I can get myself some more cold medication, because it's evident. I'll say this: if I have this cold, I brought it with me from Oklahoma, so this was my gift from Oklahoma. Either that or somewhere else. I think it was Oklahoma. But anyway, so anybody can get a hold of me. IWX on Twitter, iwx@gmail.com for email. You can complain, do whatever and whatnot. We'll be doing the recap later tonight, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, everybody have a great weekend, and I will see you for our recap later.